And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Wednesday, May 22nd. And this outlook will be for Thursday into Friday. But first, we'll check the sea ice as of this Wednesday afternoon. And just a slow melt-off continues here across the northern portion of the Bering Sea and along areas of the southwest coast, including Norton Sound and on up through the Bering Strait. Of note, we still have some shore-fast ice here down along the Yukon Delta, and that's a concern because it's not quite certain if that could hold back some of the melt-off and ice jam water that's going to be flowing down through that lower region of the Delta, especially downstream from Mountain Village through Emonic and Alakanuk. So these areas here still have the potential for some ice jam flooding through this upcoming Memorial Day weekend, and other than that, we'll just continue to see a very slow melt-off of the ice here in the northern Bering as a result of a cooler than normal spring. And looking at the weather pattern, we've had low-pressure systems that have pretty much worked their way from across the Aleutians and Bering Sea and then work their way eastward and then have secondary development in through the Gulf. Here's a secondary low bringing another round of some rain or rain showers to the Panhandle and along the Gulf Coast tonight. That's going to continue into the day Thursday. Similar low is going to take a track eastward, come on shore somewhere in the vicinity of Kuskokwim Bay and then weaken as it comes into the southwest interior. But secondary low will form here in the western Gulf this weekend and then work its way east, bringing another round of precipitation and a frontal system as it pushes into the Panhandle on Saturday. So here's the map Thursday. Low still out there in the central Bering, but it will be heading eastward along this frontal boundary with secondary development taking shape along this triple point once it gets out here in the western Gulf. And as I mentioned, the first low is already weakening with just a remnant trough on Thursday with lingering showers that I think Friday will be the better day in the Panhandle ahead of the next system. So that here we go. Here's that low working its way up into around Kuskokwim Bay, secondary low development there, just kind of in the western Gulf between the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island, and that front will work its way eastward, bringing in another round of rain over the Panhandle for Saturday. And areas of the interior, especially south-central areas, we'll see a showery pattern, especially in and around any terrain or mountainous areas. So it's not going to be an ideal weekend. There'll be some drier intervals, but there will also be some wet periods as a result. Looking at winds on Thursday in the inner channels, we're looking at southerly winds. 10 knots Lynn Canal, 15 knots Stevens Passage, 20 knots there Dixon Entrance, waves 2 feet or so there in Lynn Canal, upwards of 3-4 feet, especially down here around Dixon Entrance. Look for south winds to turn westerly, 20 to 25 knots, especially south of Sitka with swells of 6 to 7 feet. Then more of an offshore flow out of Yakutat Bay and around Cape Suckling. Northeast winds to 10 knots with 5 to 6 foot swells. And on Friday, winds will be southwest to 10 knots within the Lynn Canal, 2-foot waves, and then northwest winds around 10 knots with 2-foot waves from Stevens Passage down through Dixon Entrance. And the outer coast south of Sitka along the Gulf there, northwest winds to 20 knots, swells 6-7 feet. Westerly winds in the vicinity of Sitka on up toward Gustavus and south of Yakutat at 10 to 15 knots with 5 to 6 foot swells. On Thursday within Prince William Sound, look for northwest winds 10 knots, 2-foot waves. Outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, we're looking at west to southwest winds 15 knots. Strongest winds will be down here off the Kenai coast and lower Cook Inlet, northeast of Kodiak Island. Easterly winds 25 knots, swells 5 to 7 feet. For Friday, winds are going to turn southeasterly within Prince William Sound to 15 knots with 2-3-foot waves. Southeast winds to 20 knots here outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance. Kind of mixed winds. Look for west winds to 20 knots at the entrance and lower portion of Cook Inlet with 4 or 5-foot waves. But as we go up the inlet, we expect easterly winds of 15 knots near and north of Anchor Point. Variable winds only around 10 knots with 1-foot waves there in Upper Cook Inlet. Along Kodiak Island for Thursday, look for west to southwest winds 25 knots. And as we go down along the length of the Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds turn more south-southeasterly in the lower portion of the peninsula. And waves generally running around 5 to 7 feet on the North Pacific side and around 4 or 5 feet on the Bering side. And for Friday, generally, we're going to see some sort of southwesterly wind component, 20 to 25 knots around Kodiak Island, 25 to even 30 knots north of Cold Bay, where some of the swells could run up around or just over 10 feet. The Aleutians on Thursday will see generally southwest winds at 30 to 35 knots, and then shifting more back toward the west once you get around Kiska back toward Shemya. Swells on the North Pacific side could be as high as 15 to 20 feet, especially just south there of Atka, Adak, and Kiska. And then on Friday, we are looking at winds across the central and eastern Aleutians to generally be westerly at 25 to 30 knots. And then as we fall back further west of Adak, back toward Kiska and Shemya, variable winds only around 10 knots with swells of 6 to 8 feet. Across the southwest coast, we'll have southeasterly winds 20 to 25 knots here within Bristol and Kuskokwim Bays. South winds to 25 knots, the Pribilov Islands with 6 to 8 foot swells. Offshore flow east-southeast winds 10 to 15 knots out of Norton Sound and along the Yukon Delta with waves 2 to 3 feet. And then on Friday, as that low comes in right around this region here, around Kuskokwim Bay, at least southeast of it, we're looking for southwest to south winds 20 knots. In the circulation on the north side, easterly winds 10 to 15 knots out of Norton Sound and off of the lower Yukon Delta with waves 2 to 3 feet. And then on the backside, look for northwest to west winds 20 to 25 knots from St. Matthew down through St. Paul and St. George. For areas up along the Bering Strait, at least south of the Bering Strait, look for northeast winds 10 to 15 knots as we go up through the Chukchi Sea. Lower Chukchi Sea, west winds 5 to 10 knots, but once you get north of Point Hope, winds will generally be out of the east-northeast 20 to 25 knots, and that extends all the way up to Utqiagvik and Kaktovik. And then for Friday, look for east-northeast winds along the Arctic coast 20 to 25 knots, even 25 to 30 knot winds, especially Wainwright, down through Cape Lisburne and Point Hope, and then those winds fall back off to the northeast and north 10 to 15 knots through the lower Chukchi Sea. And then once you get south of the Bering Strait, we anticipate winds on the west side of St. Lawrence, or on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, the west side of the Seward Peninsula, north-northwest winds at 20 to 25 knots.